All right. This is our second conversation together. And today we're going to start getting into, last week we talked about, how do we get the conversation started? What are some ways? And we're going to continue to kind of talk about how to get the conversation started. Today we're going to start what I think will be a series of talks about what is the problem. And I think that's really part of how you get the conversation started is acknowledging here are problems. And the problem we're going to talk about today is separation, isolation, and the various ways that's manifesting in current culture. And so, Caleb, what you want to start off just talking about that concept of separation?
Yeah, as Brother Stephen and I have been talking, we've kind of been trying to figure out what's the fundamental problem, because it's very easy to identify systems and or symptoms of issues like, oh well, there's problems of children and not connecting with their parents, there's problems within the school system, there's problems in politics, and a lot of these things that are going around, the chaos, it signals to us that there's an issue. But as we mentioned in the first conversation, we're trying to get to the actual root of the problem, the disease, and not just get caught up in the weeds of the symptom. And so for me, as I was trying to think about this and strip it back to like its base level, it's like, okay, there's separation that's taking place. And at the very beginning on this, I want to distinguish between different types of separation, because the Bible clearly separates certain things and categorizes certain things in godly manners. And I'm not tossing that out. That's not the problem. When we're separating based upon category, based upon a limit that God has put down on, even in Genesis 1, God divides light from dark. He separates those things. He separates the waters from the dry land. God is ordering. And when there's an organization that takes place, there's necessarily a categorization and a separation. That's not a bad thing. I separate my animals. I don't put all the roosters in together because they'll kill each other. So that type of separation of order is a good one. The separation that we're looking at as a problem is where you have things that are meant to go together and we've ruptured them. We have caused this breaking, this isolation, as Stephen put it. Some people have called alienation, right? And so we're pulling those apart. And there are various reasons why we pull things apart. My toddler pulls things apart because of curiosity. My older kids, who are about 10 years old, they are pulling things apart for maybe other reasons, because they're mad at their brother and they want to get back at him, or whatever the case may be. And even for the scientists, right? There's a pulling apart because they want to be able to manipulate or synthesize. There's a whole host of reasons why separation occurs. It can be convenience, can be substitution, can be a whole host of things. But that type of separating things that are meant to go together, that's fundamentally what we want to kind of discuss. And I know Stephen's got maybe some more specified ideas, so it doesn't just stay up in the clouds or in the headspace. But that's kind of what we're working on. We're not focused. So if someone hears this real quick, if someone hears this like, oh, Caleb's against all forms of separation. No, ordered separation of what God gives between light and dark is good. Separation of like light within light and pushing apart is bad. And obviously sin is the absolute foundation of that kind of form of separation of the things that should go together, but they've been ruptured. So what do you think on that, Stephen?
Yeah. So, so we're talking about separation among people, but also of realities. And I think there's going to be some overlap, as we talked about before. You and I talked about, we'll talk about compartmentalization of aspects of our lives, and that gets into fragmentation and things like that. But to the idea of sin separating, if you look back to the beginning, we have the separation from God that I think most people, certainly, people in our circles, we're talking about Christian realities, about realities from a Christian perspective, which I would say is just reality. But if we're talking about it from that standpoint, I think most people see the separation from God, that sin causes separation from God, and they understand that. But I don't think maybe people think about I think they just think that as a stated consequence, but not a consequence that's rooted in creation, right? In the created order, that sin causes separation at fundamental levels, right? So when you see the curses that come from sin, it's not just God saying, you know what, this is how I'm going to punish you. Like if I punish my son, a lot of times I'm not punishing him in ways that automatically stem from what he did wrong. I am implementing a punishment that hopefully demotivates him to do that thing in the future, right? But I think God's punishments at the beginning are rooted in the realities of what just happened. They have sinned, and so they've put themselves at odds with God and his creation. So Eve now has difficulty introduced and separation introduced to the relationships between herself and her children and herself and her husband. And so now these are a part of the consequences of sin, is that, so you compare the curse that she gets back to the end of chapter 2, where it's they're naked and unashamed, right? They have this uninhibited union with each other. They're unified in purpose, they're unified with each other, and then sin breaks that at deep levels. And so now there's discord where there wasn't before. And then for Adam, where his creative purpose was in union with creation, working with the creation, and now he's going to have a hostile relationship with that creation. So again, there's separation that's happening because of sin. So one of the things that I think we can see as we look around just in our culture, so far removed in time and place from that moment, we're still seeing all of that, right? Sin is still separating, and we see the fracturing of homes. And I think people have a general angst and frustration about the separation in homes. But I think they've also just accepted it as normative. It just is, our homes are not what they used to be. But I think we need to not just bemoan it, but think in terms of what's happened here. And are there ways that we can try to recover at least some of the ideal? And I think that's the case in Genesis 3. When God tells Eve that she shall desire her husband, but he shall rule over her, I think he's talking about contention. But I don't think what God is saying is that you have to be satisfied with that. I think what he's saying is that's what's going to become the norm. This is going to be the normative reality. I even think as you wrestle with the earth, that it doesn't have to be a constant tension, that there are ways that you can try to work with God's creation, or you can make it a constant wrestling match.
Yeah,
and so, I think all of those curses are curses we can mitigate by trying to get back to union with God.
Right. And to emphasize that point of what you said about separation is not just this consequence that God arbitrarily puts on people as sin, or just this stated consequence. It's interesting that to think about, when did the separation actually start in Genesis 3? It didn't start after the sin. It actually started before. And this is a point that I know is very subtle. A lot of times I miss it. A lot of people miss it, right? Is that the separation started with Eve. When she started listening to Satan, she started looking at the fruit. She separated her attention. She didn't listen to her husband. She didn't even consult her husband, apparently, until after she had already eaten it. And then she goes and tempts him to eat it, and he falls. So there's before the stated separation of God with Adam and Eve, there was already a line or a pattern of separation that had been forming. And in essence, like in a lot of ways, I think of like Romans chapter 1, like God giving people over to their desires and their devices. And so if you choose a path of separation, there's going to be a consequence of that. And so it's not just like, oh, I sinned, now God's separating or forcing me into a state of separation. It's like, no, I've been pursuing personal policies and paths of separation, and now I've cross that boundary and threshold, right? And God says, all right, you got what you wanted, Caleb, in that. So I think that's a really important idea. And so when we start talking about separation, I know there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be like, okay, well, Stephen, Caleb, is this a sin? Yes or no? And they want that like black, white, light switch on, light switch off. And it's like, well, is it producing separation of things that should go together? And if the answer is yes, then well, you already have the trajectory of where it's going. I don't have to black and white say absolutely in every single case, decontextualize it and say, oh, it's always a sin for this to be something wrong. You can look at it in what I think is a more holistic biblical way and say, is this bringing together things that should be, or is it pulling them apart? And if the answer is it's pulling them apart in whatever direction, even if it might provide a temporary advantage, it's not worth it. And that was the whole thing with Eve. It's like she was promised a temporary advantage for her path of separation, and it was disastrous. So I'm
Yeah,
with you
yeah.
on that.
And I think to the point of appropriate separation, which you talked about at the beginning, that obviously God makes distinctions. The law is full of distinctions. You talked about animals, and it talks about clothing, and even the holy and the common, and what we do when we come before the presence of the Lord in a way that is distinct from the daily living in the presence of the Lord. There are distinctions and separations, but I think one of the things that's happened is maybe some true and real separations have become we've brought them outside. We've stretched them out farther than they're meant to go, and then we embrace separation where it should not be, and then the consequences of it. So I said, there's separation in the relationships because of sin. Well, when we look at a home today, going back to Genesis 2, Adam and Eve are given purpose, and it's a unified purpose, right? So Adam is given this purpose, Eve is made as a helper to that purpose. And so what you have is a joining of a husband and wife who have a singular goal. I think in modern context, our goals are very individualized, and this is pushing towards separation. And so it's not a distinct, clearly definable sin like you have in the garden, of eating of the fruit. It's a little bit more nebulous problem, but we've bought into a notion of individual activity and individual goals and aspirations and dreams that are distinct from our relationships, and that's an appropriate and right thing to have. And I think that's part of the problem. Homes today don't have purposes. Husbands and wives don't have purposes. Careers are not about providing for the home. They're about providing individualized aspirations, individualized fulfillment. And that's the argument in feminist movement, right? So for women to have careers, it's because they need to have fulfillment. And frankly, I'm more sympathetic to that than I used to be. Not because I think the home is not shouldn't be fulfilling, but that we have ripped out a lot of what was fulfilling in the home, and made it, yes, less fulfilling, because we've outmoded everything. We've outsourced everything. All the aspects of the home are now out there somewhere.
Yep.
And so one of the things I've talked about is like homes have become hotels, where after people have lived their lives, they just come here to sleep and maybe watch TV, but they're not living life at home. And so that's part of the separation, right? So we sit down at a table, maybe at best we sit down at a dinner table, and we struggle to find points of conversation. And the reason is we're not on the same page. We're not living the same life. You know, dad's got his career going this way. I mean, use my dad for example. If my dad talks about his career, I have no idea what he's talking about. He's an electrical engineer. And I vaguely can understand what he means by all of that. But for most of history, a son would be right alongside his dad, learning every day about what his dad did. And so when you're able to sit down at the table and you're able to talk not only about what we did together today, a son understands what his father's saying, but also what we did today is so integrated to this home. Mm-hmm. So I know that's idealistic, and for a lot of people, they're like, okay, but we don't live there. I got it. But at least I want us to see that picture and say, homes used to be units. When the suffrage movement began, one of the arguments made by women against the suffrage movement was that the smallest unit in a society should be considered the home.
Yep.
But now the smallest unit is the individual.
That's right.
And so that an individual's interest can and even should be distinct from the interest of the home. This is a modern concept.
Yes, it is. It's a destabilizing. It's to interject there. It's a destabilizing concept, and hopefully, I don't want to get into individualism yet, just in this conversation, because we're building to that. But I hope people, if they're listening, they can see the connection that Stephen's making to this concept of the framework that we have in terms of what is a unit, what is purpose, even as this gathered attention and a telos, or a goal, a destiny in a form. So I'm using that more like Spanish. Destino is like your arrival point. All of that, it has an impact, because if it is just me as the point, the individual as the unit or the denominator by which I'm assessing all of the world, then I can't really form connection with other people. And I'm going to always reduce things down to the individual level. And that reduction, that breaking on the basis of an individual level, is inherently causing separation. It's causing not a separation of distinction of right and wrong, or a limit of what should be. It's causing a fragmentation or a rupturing of what should be together. And to give you a real quick example, you're talking about the family. My dad talked to some Christians, and they had been married for 25 years. They were going to get a divorce. And when my dad's asking the brother, like, well, why are you getting a divorce? He goes, well, my wife and I, we don't have anything in common. I like to hunt. I like to fish. She likes to shop. We just don't do anything together. And it's like, my dad's just like, what? That's not the purpose of marriage. You're not finding a hunting buddy here. You're not finding a fishing companion. She's not finding a shopping spree companion either. But see, people have reduced that down to exactly what you're saying, of that individual. And then even husbands and wives become separated because of how they're defining things. So individualism and many of the other isms that we're going to be talking about, or philosophies or perspectives that people have, are really built upon that mechanism of separation. But when you start analyzing, it's not just like, oh, thinking as an individual is wrong inherently in and of itself. It's like, no, not necessarily in all cases, but by itself as an ideology, it's an ideology built upon separation, and it's naturally going to be causing the problems. No matter how you wrap it or how you package it, it's always going to bring you back, because the actual tool or mechanism of the function is separation. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to take those things you just mentioned, hunting and shopping. Men have been hunting for all of time.
Since the beginning, since Nimrod, yeah.
Yeah, and frankly, women have been shopping. The woman of Proverbs 31 shops. But in both cases, men hunted. I'm not saying they didn't get enjoyment out of it, but they hunted not merely for sport or hobby or self-fulfillment. They hunted to provide for their families. Mm-hmm. And women shopped to provide for their families. And again, I'm not saying they didn't get enjoyment out of it, right, but that wasn't the purpose. The
higher order level of
the purpose had to do with that connectivity of, I need to provide for my family.
Mhm.
And whether that's I need to shop so that my family is fed and clothed and so forth, or I need to hunt so that there's meat on the table, both of these things. And what that also did was it made the wife thankful for whatever he brought home, as opposed to rolling her eyes about where we're going to put this next trophy that he
Mm.
just brought home. Or it made him thankful that she's gone and she's provided all of this. She's gone and brought all this benefit back into the home. She's taken maybe the money that he made and she's transformed it into things that the family can use. And he's thankful for that, as opposed to rolling his eyes and going, oh, how much is this trip going to cost me? And so things that were meant
Mm.
that ought to bring more together are actually becoming points of division, more division. And again, it's that, I'm focused on me and about what satisfies me, what my hobbies are. I mean, just the notion of hobbies, what a
Yeah.
what a first world problem
Right.
this is.
Well, to interject real quick, Stephen, on that, and I think this is really important, a thing you're bringing out. I hadn't thought about it before. Is that especially like in marriage or family, you have these higher order things that are meant to bring us together. They're meant to bind us and to then direct our attention to a higher order. Well, our society has really done a demonic inverse. We've flipped the switch, and now it's not, God, the church, family, country. It's you at the top. And I know that's not a new critique, right? But it's interesting that if marriage is meant to be this working together, as you so well put, and explaining Genesis 2 and 3, etc., then really for most individualistic people who are living in a separatist system, marriage is just an obstacle. It's not. There's no fulfillment in it at all. In fact, it's just the ball and chain. As it was described as ball and chain for almost all of my youth, right? And even members of the church would oftentimes joke about it in that form, which they were kind of subtly giving kind of force to that wrong thing. But I saw a statistic, and I was talking to my wife Caitlin about this just last week. And among millennials and younger, so we're talking about people, 40 and younger, marriage rates used to be about 70 to 75%, up to 80%. Now, marriage rates for most people are about 30 to 35%. We've had a
Mhm.
40% reduction. And that's not an accident, right? Is because if I'm living as an individual and my goal is self-satisfaction, I have to have a separatist form to achieve that, because if I'm integrated, then I lose that kind of chief thing. I have to start sacrificing for the family. I can't just go hunting for the joy of hunting. I have to think about maybe what's best and optimal, et cetera, for other people. It pulls me out of myself. But so then family or children as well, these just become obstacles that where I would look at them, as you pointed out, the reality of the system. God's created these things. He's integrated them into our realities to help us form those bonds and to pull us together, not separate us. And so what we're doing is we're kicking back against those because we're like, no, I don't want that integration, because the integration comes with the responsibility or whatever the case may be. And I want more separatist individuals. And I don't think I've really unlocked that about the idea of these as obstacles. I knew that we were reducing in children. I knew we were reducing. I knew it had something probably to do with selfishness, but seeing them as integrated obstacles against separatist individualism makes sense
Yeah.
on a deep
I mean,
philosophic and also functional level. Why we're having such a problem with marriage and children?
yeah. And marriage, I mean, marriage is fundamentally um rooted in union. The two shall become one flesh. I mean,
Mhm.
there's no more um intense picture of unification than marriage. And yet people, I talk to people and they're like, well, we're gonna keep our separate bank accounts, and I'll have my money and he'll have his money. I'm like, what are you talking about? Right. So what that is it's a fight to hold on to my distinctness,
Mm.
my separateness from this. and you could, bear this out in a lot of other ways. I mean, I talked about women taking on a man's name, right, in marriage, and that this is a biblical concept. And I, I don't have time to go into all that, but if somebody had a question about that, I'd be perfectly willing to talk more about that. But I was talking about that, and somebody said, well, how do you feel about your daughter giving up your name? And I'm like, she better. If my daughter came to me and said, I'm keeping my name, I would say, what? I'm giving you away. I'm giving you in marriage, and you're becoming his, and that would be perverse if you somehow clung to mine, which is incidentally a hilarious thing, that when women say, I'm going to keep my name. So you're gonna deny this man taking his name. You're going to hold to your father's name. You're still keeping a man's name, right? So at some point you're defeating whatever it is point you're trying to make. Right. But the reality is that there needs to be that surrender to the unification. But again, this goes down into kids. People are so afraid of imposing their values or imposing their own wills onto their children. And so they want their children to be independent. I don't want my children to be independent. I want them to be invested as a part of the family. I want them to look at what we do in our home as their own inheritance, and that they are participants in their own inheritance, and that as much as they contribute and make this home better, they are improving what they themselves are a part of and are inheritors of.
Yep.
And again, fragmentation.
Right. That doesn't deny personal responsibility. Someone's listening to Stephen and saying, oh, well, Stephen's just for like this patriarchal erasure of all individual responsibility or identity. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is bring it into an integrated higher form of identity. And that is a very reality. I remember when I was younger, there was a very well-known preacher in the Midwest, and he was speaking about raising children. And he said, the number one goal for parents is to raise their children to be independent. He said that. And I went, and I was full of, vinegar and bravado, but I was like, hey, where in the Bible does it say that? And sure, maybe my attitude wasn't right, but the point was right, because the point is to raise them in the discipline and nurture and admonition of the Lord, which isn't, oh, we want you to be an atomized, separate individual. That's like the goal of everything, but it moves to integration. And so what Stephen's talking about with the example of the family, this is just one. I mean, we can go and we can look at the way we do business, the way we do church, the way we, interact, all levels. There's these movements to separation on our way of life, our practice, and our conceptualization. And so when we're moving to separation on things, we have to understand, why are we doing that? There's always a reason. It's not just arbitrary. And there's a reason why people are moving to, have moved to an individualization. We're feeling the negative effects on it. And some of us might scratch our heads and say, like, well, why in the world are we doing this when it's causing so much harm? Well, there's a benefit that people want. And just like what we talked about, right, with the example of the husband and wife, and the husband wants to go hunt, the wife wants to go shop. It's like there's a benefit for pushing against that integration, but it comes with such your terrible cost. You're pushing against the realities that God has created, and you can reap the temporary benefit. Same thing in Genesis 3. There were temporal benefits for Eve eating the fruit, undeniably, but at what cost? And that's one of the things where we don't do a very good job thinking about the costs, and we kind of kick the can down the road in a lot of ways. And I would even argue that there's probably something about individualistic separatism that incapacitates us or blinds us from the ability to examine situations, because if there are negative impacts that take place, then they just get kind of put on the individual level. People don't start calling into question saying, well, hey, maybe we're doing family wrong. Hey, maybe we're doing maybe there's a broader thing that's going on here. And as Steve and I are trying to talk about the problem, people, and I was kind of hinting at this in the first conversation, people might just say, oh, well, Stephen and Caleb are having midlife crisis. That's exactly what we're talking about. This is this kind of move to be like, oh, it's just individualized with them.
Yeah.
if you just keep the problems always just individualized, like you're creating this separatist form, and you're not really able to see, no, together, ironically, we are individually moving to more separation. So I don't know if
Yeah.
that's making sense or too abstract, but
Well, and I mean, so if we think about this, like, in terms of, how this affects us, and you were talking about, like, when people, um, you said in businesses and things like
Mhm.
that. I think we see people trying to overcome the effects of this in certain aspects, right? So a lot of businesses work really hard on unification, on getting everybody on the same page, and they do things to try to create loyalty and so
Yep.
forth within the company.
They'll call themselves family, like
Yeah,
over a family
yeah,
here.
yeah, that's right. To get by,
Like,
you see this on athletic teams, right?
yeah,
Very
it's like,
competitive athletic teams, just trying to get together, and what they're trying to do is overcome that sort of individualized approach. Right? There's no I in team. All those cliches.
mm,
But I think a lot of our cliches, that sort of, the cliche of the independent child, right? That's what I want to do, is create an independent child. I do want my child to be able to think independently about how to help this family, right? I want him to think about that, to have that sort of independent mind. But one of those cliches is like about faith. We say, look, they got to develop their own faith.
yeah.
Now, there's a truth to that, right? That their faith does need to be something that they themselves believe and hold and so forth. But biblically speaking, Timothy has
Yeah.
the faith of his mother and his grandmother, right? So that's what Paul tells Timothy. He says, you have the faith of your mother and your grandmother. He doesn't say, hey, Timothy, you got to, he doesn't say that as derogatory.
Right.
He says that as a compliment, that he's carrying on what his mother and his grandmother had. When we see, I think this is one of the reasons we struggle with like the concept of, the centurion, about Cornelius and his whole household.
Mhm.
We're like, in our minds, it's like his two kids, right? His wife and two kids. No, this would have been a cast of dozens, perhaps, of people who would have followed the patriarch of that family because they had a unified vision of the home.
Mhm.
And they also looked to him as the leader and the exemplar in the home. And he had developed, this is one of the things, as you're looking at the symptoms, guys will hear this and they're like, yeah, I'm going to go home and I'm going to tell my family. No, he had developed a trust that
Yes.
made them look to him and say, we trust you, wherever you're headed. And we're so scared of that. We're
Mhm.
like, I'm not putting that kind of trust in anybody.
Right.
Well, I think that's right. We don't put that kind of trust in anybody. And that's the problem, is that we don't think we can trust. It's a problem with a lot of marriages. Here's one of the phrases that I say in marriages, in vows that I write, if they ask me to write the vows. For the woman, I say, from this day forward, I trust you with my life. And I got some pushback on that. Like,
Hmm.
what are you asking me to say here? And I'm like,
Huh.
I'm asking you to trust this man with your life.
Right.
And if you don't, then you probably shouldn't be getting into this relationship.
That's right.
And so I think people have they balk at it because of our modern notions of maintain independence,
Yep.
and this is just not a biblical concept.
Yep.
Um,
It's
and
rooted
you
on
know,
it's rooted on separation. And one thing I was going to say real quick it's interesting as we see these mimicries, right, in these kind of spectacles of family, as you mentioned, with teams or with businesses. It's really ironic because, as you pointed out, the family has been separated and fractured, and so these other ones that are trying to like co-opt and create this sense of integration, they look at the family because they're like, oh, that should be the system of integration. And ironically, they're calling upon something that's completely hollow right
Yes.
now. And so it's all, and people become so jaded. They can't trust the concept of even family anymore because the dad walks out, look, he's like going for milk and never comes back, as the meme says, right? And like there's no integration. We've become so jaded whatsoever. It's a complete fracturing. And all of this, I think, is built upon separation. I'm separating my desires, my identity, everything. And then so when societies become completely atomized and individualized, or some use the word like idiosyncrasies, right? This individuality there's nothing that binds at all.
Mm.
And people feel that across the board. They know like the concept of, or the myth of America, or the myth of all these things bringing us together is crumbling around us because there's no form of integration, and everything is built on separation. Separation violates trust. And then what do you have? You have nothing. And this is going back to our first conversation. People wanted to say, well, we want to just get back to normal. Well, the 90s or the 80s or the 60s, they're built on the same separation. Maybe they were kind of riding the wave, or the coattails of previous systems that had greater integration, but you can't move towards that separation and avoid the chaos that's coming. That's just like with Eve. Eve, if she followed those lines of separation, she was always going to eat the fruit 100% of the time. And the same thing that's happening here. And so people just want to move the sliding scale to where they're like, well, we like our separation and individualism. We don't want to fully give it up. We don't want to go where Stephen's saying about all this trusting my husband, or trusting the family, or having this sacrificial concept of duty or piety. I don't want that. So we just got to move it back to where maybe the excesses are put into control. And it's like, that's not going to work.
Yeah. So to kind of, come back to sin and how this relates to sin, because as you said, there are people who want to know. So are you putting this in sin, not sin categories? And it's not just that, but I guarantee you it leads to sin. Sin causes it, and it leads to sin. Both and so I would say, for instance, to your point of businesses and sports teams, whatever, appealing to this image that isn't really there. I think that's happening in churches. So churches say, we need to be more like a family. I think we are. And that's the problem.
Ouch. Ouch.
I think we're like most of our families, which is we're fractured. We all go our own directions, and every once in a while we get together and have a conversation. And it's not a very deep conversation because we're living all our own lives. And when somebody actually says, hey, let's do this thing that families ought to do, it's very awkward. And then I would point to like, honor your father and mother. This is an age-old cross-cultural principle. When Paul says somebody that doesn't take care of their father or mother is worse than an infidel, what he's saying is everybody knows this. Everybody knows this. But we've offloaded that responsibility, right? We've moved it to a more convenient place. And what is the reasoning? Parents who that's being done to will say, I never want to be a burden to my children. I don't want to disrupt their lives. That's their job. That's their responsibility. And even pagans have known that that's their responsibility, to disrupt their lives and bring in parents. And people will say, that's going to be so hard. Yes, of course it's hard. And I'll say it's harder because for our own conveniences, we have 1, 2 children instead of half a dozen or a dozen children who share that responsibility. Now we've, again, so we could live our own individual lives. We didn't have very many children because they were got in the way of that. And now that we rely on our children to help us in our old age, they're not there. We don't have them. Yeah. Or we did have them, but we told them to go, leave, live your own life, and now they're not around to help us.
Yeah.
And so we actually have ended up building a structure that encourages people to ignore some base elements of this command to honor father and mother, which is, I mean, you see the way Jesus talks about that. As they get older, we talk about honor father and mother's obedience, but honor father and mother moves from a child parent, young child parent relationship of obedience and that sort of honor to care for and provide for. I remember years ago reading Phyllis Schlafly wrote an article, and it was about Social Security. And she said, we used to have Social Security before it was introduced as a government program. It was called Having Kids and Raising Them Well.
Yep.
And so this is another form. This is what this leads to. So if you're like, here's consequences. Now, I know people might listen to this and might be offended and say, listen, we are providing for them by putting them in the nursing home. I would defy you to find a nursing home that you would want to live in. That is honoring. They are not honoring places. My daughter's in nursing school, and she spent some time now in several nursing homes. And she said, she's come home and she said, I will kill myself taking care of you before I'll ever put you in one of those places.
Right.
And I'm glad to hear that. Right. And
to maybe just also further contextualize and emphasize, if someone's sitting here thinking, oh, Stephen's just harping on people who put their parents in nursing homes, that's not the point. And we're not here to even judge any particular situation. What Stephen's also talking about is the reason this has been normalized and the problems that it caused is because we collectively and individually have made a long series of decisions about our philosophy, about our practices, our individual desires that have led us to these points, and we're crumbling under the weight of these decisions. I believe God is kind of like letting us, letting that separation come to its full fruition. And so once again, going back to the idea of this is not ideal, right? We don't have to go and just like castigate or just destroy someone who's done this to say, okay, but we don't want to make that the norm. We need to move in the right direction, right? And this is one of the things, even talking about family, I try to do with my kids. Instead of being like, okay, who's to blame? We're running late. Who's to blame? It's like, how do we progress? Let's focus on that. And I think that's, if I'm putting words in your mouth, I'm sorry, Stephen, but I think that's what kind of the focus is here is this current system is not what it should be. We need to move to those progression points, and to be able to meet those progression points, we have to be honest. Current system's not working, and then how did that actually get?
Yeah, so somebody bringing the parents into their home and taking care of them in their home, that's the exception
Today. Yeah.
Whereas that ought to be the norm. And I understand somebody says, look, there was medical attention that was needed on a constant basis. Okay, well, we could talk about that, and that's I'm not heartless about those conversations, but I think what people, if we're all the exceptions, then that's not an exception, that's the rule, that's the norm, and this should not be the norm. We should be willing to disrupt our lives because, again, of that unification. I mean, frankly, just the notion that we live in different places and that we're disconnected, generationally disconnected, right? We don't live, when you look in the Bible, a household would include multiple generations, right? So that would have been another unification. So we talk about, what is it? Immediate family, right? So
or the nuclear family,
the nuclear family or immediate family. And so those are terms we use for parents and children, right? That's your immediate family is parents and children. And this is considered the home. Well, already that itself is a disunity where we've separated generations. And then of course, there's other ways that we separate generations, and we think kids ought to be with kids their own age and so forth. And that's the ideal, is that they spend most of their time with people their own age. Again, that's modern.
Yep.
I'm blessed to have grown up near my grandparents, spending a lot of time at both sets of grandparents' house, particularly my mom's because we lived near them, and I spent probably far more time around old people and old men in particular than most kids my age got to, and and so I'm shaped by that, and people need to be shaped by that generational wisdom. When people say, I want my kids to spend lots of time around other people their age, well, I don't, I mean, I want them to have those experiences, but where do I want them to learn knowledge from?
Mhm. Yeah.
I,
Well, and that's a form of separation too.
yeah,
When you're just isolating kids around kids their own age, you're creating an artificial separation from older people. And this is one of the things with like the failure among sects and denominations with children's church, which has been an absolute catastrophe among those movements. It's because it's like, oh, let's separate the kids. And it's like that's what we're talking about here is like stop and think, am I separating things that should not be separated? Or am I actually creating a separation that's based upon revealed truth? And kind of going back to a point you made earlier in the conversation, J.R. Bronger, he had a sermon about threshold walkers as being profane, right? And I love J.R. and his teaching when I was younger was very helpful. But that's the idea is like there's a distinction and you're trampling all over this distinction. The irony in all of this is that the good separation in our lives and culture, we have moved that. Male, female, not going to worry about those distinctions. Truth, error, not going to worry about those distinctions. But then the things that should be together, we've isolated those, just like you're talking about with family example. And then for someone who comes along and says, hey guys, we need to put those things back together, and the things that we've actually meshed together where there is a threshold, we need to separate those. That kind of return back to biblical normality or like ancient traditional truth seems so radical because
yeah,
people have treated those separations, the isolation or rupturing, as something holy. No, you keep kids in their own group, for example, and they see the other one as just being like, well, we can't be arrogant and say this is this and that is that. And so we've completely inverted things on all this. So it's very, very confusing
yeah, yeah,
for everybody involved. And I appreciate your points on all that with the family. And just to stress, and maybe I'm a little too cautious on this, but it's a lot of this has been handed to us, right? And the norms that we receive are things that impact us. And but like Ezekiel 18, we have a responsibility if we're going to further that separatist norm, or if we're going to change things and go back to the integrated whole of what Christ invites us to. And so
yeah.
we're
And
not
that's
we're not
and all of it,
having the problem. We're
yeah.
calling people to take responsibility to move forward.
In all of this, what I want us to have in mind is, as we talk about Christ as the ideal,
Mhm.
are there some ways that we will look at the life of Christ and say, I don't know how to fully integrate that in my life? Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some distinctions. But what we want to have, and we want to be able to say, yes, but I know what the ideal picture looks like. And so I'm looking in that direction. I'm leaning in that direction. I'm thinking in that direction. And even where there are places where I say, okay, but because of the time and place in which I live, I'm not going to be able to accomplish that. Like just the picture of the household in the New Testament, we just don't live there, right?
Yeah.
But there are things about that I want to say, okay, but at least I could grab hold of this part and try to reintegrate that into our lives today, and try to peel back some of the bad effects of modernism, even while we live in a modern world.
Mhm.
Um, just, I
Man,
mean,
I've got so many questions for you on that aspect too, and hopefully maybe in a I don't know if we put it on the schedule or not, but I would love to have a conversation about that and ask you some of your views on how do we start putting that into practice? Because if someone listens to this and is like, okay, I'm tracking separatism wrong, the way that this has impacted the family wrong. I hear Stephen. I got that idea, that ideal. I want to start pursuing that ideal. now, boom, what are the brass tacks, so to speak? What are the actual day in, day out steps that I need to be getting to? That's obviously a much longer conversation, but man, I would love to talk about that, because those are things that I'm asking myself a lot about,
Yeah.
because it is great to have that ideal, but the sacrifices in work have to be aligned and actually just have to be done to make that ideal become realized.
Yeah. Yeah. If we don't have the ideal, then we're just going to keep spiraling in the same direction we're going.
That's right.
And that's what I just at least lay an anchor down and say, okay, let me at least stop drifting with where everybody else is going,
Mm-hmm.
and then see how I can at least inch back in that direction. So anyway, I appreciate the discussion. We've gone a little bit over. We probably will, that would probably not be the last time we do that. But the next time we're going to talk, a lot of this will bleed over into the next. We're going to talk about fragmentation, which goes along with a lot of this isolation and separation. They kind of feed each other. So we'll talk more about that. But appreciate it.
And Lord willing, and we'll do some more discussion on this. I think kind of viewing fragmentation just as kind of a little primer. But maybe, I mean, we've talked about we've used the family as that kind of the object of investigation or application in this particular thing. And as we've mentioned, it's not the only manifestation of separation. But one of the things in particular, I would like to look at fragmentation as applied to our concept of church. You and I kind of hinted at the idea of restoration, our concept of restoration. I think some of those more like conceptual things sometimes obviously have real life implications, applications, but hopefully maybe we'll be able to get to analyze some of those things as well. So.
Yep. All right. Appreciate it, Caleb. And we'll pick back up next time.
All right. God bless.